just saw over the weekend Twisters, directed by Lee Isaac Chung, starring Glenn Powell, Daisy Edgar-Jones, amongst other people. The sequel to the original film from 1996, involving two teams of storm chasers trying to capture certain data of a tornado, where one team wants to release certain chemicals into the funnel and reduce its intensity, whereas the other team wants to use the data that they collect for their own business-oriented type of purposes. As for the original film, I watched that quite often when I was a kid. I did a review of it a couple years back, and every now and then I still like to go back and have some fun with it. How could you not like some of the actors in there, like Bill Paxton or the late Philip Seymour Hoffman? It was intense. That was intense. Yeah, trust me, Rabbit is good, Rabbit is wise. So when a sequel was announced for Twister with Twisters, I, for one, was not that thrilled about it. I know it's really easy to cry about how many sequels that we're getting and that we're getting too many from Hollywood, and that Hollywood's very obsessed with trying to bring back something that was popular once before in the past. I've kind of gotten used to it by now, and I don't really see a need to talk about why we don't need sequels like this. Even though the trailers on my end did look somewhat appealing, I didn't really see a need for it. And after that, I thought maybe I'll get to it eventually, but I'm not in a rush to see it. And then the reviews started to come out, and it piqued my interest. And some of you actually messaged me saying how surprised you were. Not to mention that it has one of the most popular actors in the business right now, Glenn Powell from Top Gun Maverick. How can I not give it a try? I have to say that I was kicking myself in the butt for being such a moron for not being so excited about this, because I am really happy to report that this was a welcome surprise. Is it a great movie? Not in the least bit. But is it a fun movie? Absolutely. I'd say it's about on the same level with its predecessor. Maybe in some ways even better than the first one. I'm going to go into some details of the plot, but I'm not going to go too deep into it, so mild spoilers in case you guys don't want to know. As for the story and characters, it's basically more or less of what we saw the first time around. Daisy Edgar-Jones' character Kate is a storm chaser who's living for the thrill of getting inside a tornado, wanting to launch these chemicals into the air, into the funnel to maybe reduce its intensity. And then she experiences a very traumatic event, losing her friends in the storm, including her boyfriend, who gets sucked up in the tornado, and she's the only survivor, next to her friend Javi. Just like in the original film where Jo, Helen Hunt's character, loses her father to an F5 tornado when she's 5 years old. In both of these situations, we get a good look of why the main characters are the way they are. Then it cuts to 5 years later, where she's working for the National Weather Service in New York City, getting a visit from Javi, who invites her back into the idea of storm chasing. After some initial reluctance on her part, she agrees to accept the offer. And as the rest of the film goes on, it's basically her and this other storm team led by Tyler, played by Glenn Powell, rivaling against each other to get the data on said tornadoes that they encounter in the area. I'm not the first person to say this, but I was not really expecting some sophisticated entertainment to come out of this. Along with its predecessor, with a movie like Twisters, you have to know exactly what you're going to get. It's pure popcorn entertainment. There's a lot of scientific jargon and mumbo-jumbo that may or may not make any sense, and I'm not a meteorologist, so I wouldn't know exactly what term is correct and what's not. But there are certain things that characters say in both of these movies that make me go, I'm not really sure if that's how meteorology works, or I don't know if that's something that storm chasers would say. But again, I'm not a scientist nor am I a filmmaker, so I don't know what I'm talking about on that case. I was able to really suspend my disbelief and just let the movie be what it was supposed to be. But if that kind of stuff bothers you, this is not the movie for you, because you're going to watch this and go, that doesn't make sense, that doesn't add up, what's that all about? That's wrong, that's inaccurate, I don't understand this, why are they doing this? And trust me, there's quite a few moments in this movie that make me go, you should not be living after that. There's a couple times where Glenn Powell's character in his truck is able to dig into the ground, getting really close to that tornado, even when it's right on top of him, and somehow he manages to survive, along with some other people that he's got on his team. Even someone like me who's not really knowledgeable on tornadoes and everything, I thought, you should definitely be piles of dirt somewhere else on the ground right now. But again, with this type of movie, knowing what it is, I was able to let that go. If some of you are not going to be sold on it, I totally understand. As with its predecessor, there are some really thrilling and exciting sequences throughout the entire thing. Their first encounter when they get close to a tornado, as they get closer and Daisy Edgar-Jones starts to back away, as opposed to Jo, Helen Hunt's character, who gets so mesmerized by what she sees, practically putting herself in harm's way. But just like with Jo and Bill, her instincts catch in when she starts to realize what the tornado is going to do, and the other team doesn't catch on until it's too late. Whether or not any of this mumbo-jumbo makes 100% complete sense. I do like seeing the instincts and the knowledge that the characters have on these tornadoes. And Lee Isaac Chung, who's the director of this film, brings a really good visceral sense of energy to this whole thing, with his production team blending CGI and practical effects perfectly together. Lee Isaac Chung at one point lived in Arkansas in his youth. With tornadoes being a common occurrence in that part of the country, he understands the severity of it all. Now, where I live in South Central Pennsylvania, they're not unheard of, but they're not exactly common either. I think the biggest one that we've had is maybe an F3 in the past, but even then, you're not really going to see an F5 in Pennsylvania. I mean, if anything, it's very, very, very rare. But tornadoes do happen up here in the northeastern states. I hope to God that I never see one up close, because real life footage will do just fine. And even then, it's still terrifying. And he also shows how Tyler's storm chasing team takes the situation very seriously whenever a town gets wiped out by a tornado. The whole community bands together to help each other through the rubble, and the storm chasers play their part, even though they're very, whoa, 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 yeah, let's get that tornado. When the situation requires it, they take it seriously and volunteer to help the people in need. Just like in the first film, when Aunt Meg gets in trouble and almost gets crushed in her house, they all show up to help her out. Even with all of their carefree fun and reckless enthusiasm, they know how scary the situation will be. As for the characters, there is a surprisingly decent amount of depth. The characterizations are pretty standard and basic, nothing really groundbreaking. Like I said, very similar to the original film where Jo was haunted by the death of her father. Kate, in this case, is haunted by the death of her friends and her boyfriend. It is more or less the same, but it's also played out differently. And in the case of this, we actually get a more full-fledged look of Kate's character arc as opposed to Jo, who does get some recognition and some payoff in the original film when Bill Paxton's character confronts her about her being haunted by the death of her father. Kate is able to really let out what she's been feeling after all this time, and Tyler, instead of talking her out of it, just sits there and listens to her. And by the film's finale, I don't really think it's a surprise on what could happen, even though I was wondering if they were going to subvert expectations. I'll keep my spoilers to a minimum, but it does play out somewhat of how I expected, but I still found myself fairly invested and actually felt very cathartic by the time it paid off. As for Glenn Powell's character, Tyler, who's a social media YouTube star, broadcasting all of his storm chasing endeavors in the entire world, comes off as a very big showboat at first, but then as the film goes on and we learn more about him, we realize that he actually is just a person. He's not just some caricature that doesn't really care about anybody else other than his own notoriety. And even though this film takes place in Oklahoma, Tyler is supposedly from Arkansas, along with his storm chasing team. I really do like how that they're not portrayed as stereotypical southern redneck hillbillies. As far as the ethnicity goes, it's a very diverse group of people, and I'm learning more of this as I get older. There's all kinds of people living in the South, but they also have that reckless, enthusiastic spirit that Southerners are known for, I suppose. At least that's the vibe that I've heard about Southerners for a while. I mean, I've been to the South, not too often, but I do kind of get that general vibe anyway. Correct me if I'm wrong. And they are very similar to Jo's storm chasing team, who are very energetic and fun and exciting, although I do kind of miss the individual characters that I remember anyway, like Rabbit or Dusty. Maybe with a couple of rewatches I'll be able to remember some of their names, but one of the actresses I actually recognized from The Mandalorian. She was a Imperial officer, and that also does make sense since Lee Isaac Chung directed an episode of The Mandalorian with Season 3. So those connections really do help. Given that this is a legacy sequel, I was waiting for some kind of a big overt connection to the original film, but all we really get are just small callbacks or some small Easter eggs throughout the entire thing. In the opening scene, Kate and her friends are using the Dorothy device that Jo and Bill tried to use on the tornadoes in the original film, and the rodeo sequence that we see in the trailers I think was more or less a callback to the drive-in theater scene in the first film where we see The Shining playing on the big screen, and maybe a line or two that's very similar to what we hear the first time around, like, it's shifting, or no, it's going to shift to the right. We don't see a returning cast member or character show up, like, say, Rabbit, or even Helen Hunt. Now, I don't really know what the logistics were behind this whole thing. Maybe they couldn't afford to get anybody to make an appearance of some kind, or maybe some people weren't interested, or at least the ones that were still alive, given that Bill Paxton and Philip Seymour Hoffman have unfortunately passed on. On the one hand, that is actually kind of refreshing. That being said, if they found a way to properly integrate a previous established character into this plot, then I would have been fine with it. The only connection that I really see to the previous film is at one point during that rodeo sequence, there's one hotel guest who's very unhappy with the way things are going in this hotel. That actor is actually Bill Paxton's son, James. The movie doesn't really make a big deal out of it or anything, but I do like those small nods of recognition that the movie makes. And maybe I am spoiled by the original, but I did really miss hearing the song Humans Being by Van Halen in this one. The soundtrack is very southern rock and country flavored. I'm not really a country music fan. Some of it I'm okay with, but generally speaking, not really. It's a huge nitpick. It's not really a deal breaker, but I would have liked at least some type of echo of that original soundtrack. Maybe just a small glimmer of that Van Halen song. So Twisters is definitely a welcome surprise that I was not disappointed by in the least bit. Knows exactly what type of movie it is and doesn't apologize for it at all. If you're into popcorn entertainment, this is the movie for you. If not, you're not gonna have a good time. Either way, I think this movie has a little bit of something for everybody. Oh my god, I forgot all about David Cornsweet. He's the business partner of Kate's friend who's part of the business-oriented storm chasing team. And to see him play the opposite of what Superman's supposed to be, no nonsense and no sense of optimism, that I found to be kind of interesting and ironic in a way. Yes, I know that's what actors do, but I am curious to see what he has to offer for Superman. And this movie is my introduction to him, so we'll see what he can bring next year. Those are my thoughts on Twisters. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are on this movie if you've seen it. And as always, see you in the next one.